Hey there, folks. Today we're diving into all the Easter eggs, references, and details you might have missed in episode 3 of X-Men. It was a rather strange episode, adapting one of the most controversial stories in comics. A story so controversial that the writer still gets annoyed when it comes up. I'm going to explain everything that happened and tell you exactly when, in my opinion, Jean was replaced by a clone. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video to stay updated. Your likes and subscriptions help the project grow, and the project growing means I can bring you more interesting videos. Deal? Thanks for the support. Moving on. The episode opens with the classic previously on X-Men, but notice it's Jean's voice. In the original series, Scott, the leader, always narrated that intro. In the last episode, it was Magneto to show a change in leadership. This episode is about Jean, indicating that she is the focus of the story. I'm going to explain the comic book history this episode is based on and why Chris Claremont, a longtime writer for the X-Men, hated to write this story. You probably all know the Phoenix Saga, when Jean Grey was possessed by a flaming space bird, turning her into an almost goddess-like heroine. In the comics and the series, the Phoenix drove Jean crazy and consumed an entire star system. Eventually, Jean was sentenced to death and chose to take her own life before the Phoenix could kill again. In the series, she was resurrected with the life forces of different X-Men members, but in the comics, her death was meant to be permanent. Chris Claremont, who wrote the X-Men for 16 years, believed in long story arcs with real consequences, yet he still wanted to give Cyclops a happy ending and write him out of the story so that new heroes could be introduced. So he created Madeline Pryor, a woman who looked very much like Jean Grey. Eventually, she and Scott got married, had a son named Nathan, and moved to Alaska. But then Marvel's editorial team, looking at Gene Schuster, decided they wanted a new team with the original X-Men. Not only did Claremont have to bring Jean Grey back, but he also had to give Cyclops a reason to leave his wife. And it gets quite complicated. I'll explain some specific points from the comics as we go along, but briefly, Scott started a team called X Factor, and Madeline joined the X-Men even though she didn't have any powers. Eventually, it's revealed that Madeline is a clone of Jean Grey, created by Mr. Sinister, just like we see in this episode. When the Phoenix sacrificed itself on the moon, a piece of the Phoenix entered Madeline, giving her some of John's memories and powers. Over time, Madeline goes insane and makes a deal with a demon, becoming the villain known as the Queen of the End. There was a big crossover event called Inferno, where two demons opened a portal over Manhattan and started turning the city into a living hell. At one point, Madeline even tries to sacrifice her own son to keep the portal open. She's finally defeated and dies, and then, of course, returns in a later issue. After all, in comics, no one dies. Personally, I've never been a big fan of the Madeline saga because I think it lessens the impact of death when comic book characters keep coming back to life. And X-Men writer Chris Claremont has the same position, but I have to be honest, on this show I think they adapted it really well. And that sets the stage for an even darker story, which will come later in the season. I'll explain everything as we go along and answer the big question. When was Jean Grey replaced by a clone? I'll give you a hint, it was recently, but leave your theory in the comments below. Now, going back to what I was saying, just like in episode 2, the new intro has some cool changes. We see the first fight of the X-Men with Magneto at the missile base, adapted from the first issue of the X-Men, and we also see the Dark Phoenix. As I said earlier, this was a massive 9-part saga in the series in the 3rd season. It was the most ambitious story ever made for a Saturday morning cartoon, when most cartoons were episodic and did not connect into longer story arcs. We also see Robert running to the wire fence in place of Jubilee. I think in the last episode I said he was leaving, but it looks like I was wrong. Now it looks like he's going to stay and be a student at the school, fulfilling the role that Jubilee had in the original series. As I mentioned last week, in the comics, Robert was one of the founding members of the New Mutants, a group of young students that Xavier trained at the school. In the comics, just like in the series, Xavier left Earth and asked Magneto to lead the team. But instead of leading the X-Men, he took on more of the role of school principal and appeared in the New Mutants comic book for about 50 issues. I would love to see this series spin off into a New Mutants series. After all, we already met Sam Gertz, also known as Missile, last season when Rogue tried to recruit him. I don't think any 16-year-old boy would mind a visit from a nice girl from the South. We met another member of the New Mutants in the original series who was Illyana, Colossus' sister. Illyana was incredibly important in the Inferno crossover event, and she appears in this episode during the battle. Morpho transforms into Illyana twice. The first time with the New Mutants uniform with a magical persona, and the second time in his other identity, a Dark Child. Look, I could go into a long explanation here, but I don't think it's super necessary to understand this episode. In short, Colossus's little sister gains demonic powers, acquires the ability to teleport, and is tricked into opening a portal to Limbo during the Inferno event. If Illyana appears again in the series, I'll go into more detail and explain a bit more when Morpho transforms into her later. We also get a glimpse of Professor Xavier and Lilandra. Lilandra is the empress of the galaxy-spanning Shi'ar Empire, and she and Professor Xavier are in love. In the final episode of the original series, she took him to space to save his life, just like what happened in the 200th issue of the X-Men. In fact, long before that issue, the Shi'ar cloned a new body for Professor Xavier, and he was able to walk again. So if Professor X is still alive in space, he may have regained the use of his legs by the time he returns to Earth. I think seeing him in the credits is a big hint that he's going to return, but probably only at the end of this season. After we witness Scott watching Phoenix sacrificing herself on the moon, a scene of Gambit and Rogue flirting in the basketball court was also added. We saw them in these outfits in the first episode, but the same outfits were adapted from the Lady Lethal storyline in the original season, which was in turn adapted from the 4th issue of the X-Men. This episode is called Fire and Flesh, which is how Phoenix described herself, and that's an interesting addition because you see in the comics, Claremont's original intention was for the Phoenix to possess Jean Grey and drive her mad, but years later, to bring her back from the dead, he had to reconfigure that. The Phoenix just copied John's body and let her real body heal at the bottom of the Hudson River, inside a cocoon. That means the Phoenix rebuilt Jean's body and let her real body recover at the bottom of the Hudson River within a cocoon. It was literally fire and flesh. In this series, something similar might have happened. The Phoenix rose from the water just like in the comics, but there was also a time in the series when the Phoenix had to take the Macaron crystal to the sun for safekeeping, and when she came back, the Phoenix was driving Jean mad. These are all instances when the Phoenix could have replicated Jean's form, possibly in the Hudson River or before she flew to the sun. Mr. Sinister may not have cloned Jean at all. What he may have actually found was the original Jean, cocooned at the bottom of the river, then used that original Jean to create a clone. So, what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe Jean never really came back from the sun. Perhaps the Jean we see in the Dark Phoenix saga was, in fact, the clone, Madeline Pryor, all along. But again, this is just a possible theory. I have a more solid idea about when Jean might have been replaced, which I'll discuss later in this video. So when Jean's clone, who I'll call Madeline, is reading Jean's mind, she sees Jean's story, but with blank faces. This is taken directly from the comics. In the book The Descent of Madeline, the insanity takes some time. For a while, she's been with the X-Men, being the person behind the operations. But when she finds out that Jean has come back to life and Scott is with her, she has this nightmarish vision where Jean slowly rips out her own face, calling Madeline a cheap copy. In these visions, we see Jean from the original series with her face blank, Jean in the Marvel Girl costume on the moon, and this scene of Scott holding Jane. To me, it feels like they're recreating the scene from the season 1 episode Acura when Jean recognizes that the vampire is jealous of her and her relationship with Scott. Moving forward, we see Scott and Jean kissing, with the jealous Wolverine in the foreground. This is taken from the season 1 episode Captive Hearts, when Jean sees Scott's eyes for the first time. Soon after, we see when the X-Men fought Dark Phoenix in Central Park, and we find out what Wolverine thinks about ducks. He doesn't like ducks. Later, we see Scott at Jean's bedside when she was recovering after becoming the Phoenix. Then we have their first wedding, with Morph disguised as a priest conducting the ceremony. It's the beginning of that situation where Scott and Jean can never have a happy marriage. In the episode Beyond Good and Evil, Jean is kidnapped shortly after they get married, and now they don't even know if they're really married because they can't tell who is the clone and who is the real Jean. We then see Jean waking up in a Victorian-era laboratory, which belongs to Mr. Sinister. In the season 5 episode Descent, we see Mr. Sinister's origin in Victorian London. He was a scientist named Nathaniel Essex, obsessed with mutation. He modified humans and himself to become practically immortal. Interesting motivation, but it's still murder, right? Then he spent the next 100 years obsessing over the idea that he could perfect the mutant genome and create the perfect race, which of course he would rule. In season 2, we find out that he believes Scott and Jean are the genetically perfect mutants and that he's monitored them their entire lives. In the comics, after Scott's mother died and his father went into space, Scott was placed in an orphanage that actually belonged to Mr. Sinister and housed his secret laboratory. Years later, Sinister cloned Jean to match his genetic samples, but when Jean sacrificed himself on the moon, the Phoenix Force found the clone's body and practically brought it back to life. In the series, Mr. Sinister kidnapped Scott and Jean twice to try and collect genetic material from them. After it looked like Jean had died on the moon, it made sense that he would replace her with a clone. I'll explain exactly why later in that same video. Quite old-fashioned on TV, we see Val Cooper, a government liaison about mutant relations, and then there's Magneto's trial from the last episode where Storm was shot. Then, for some reason, we see the X-Mansion, even though the X-Men are supposed to have secret identities and nobody should know they operate in this modest school for talented youngsters. But then the government just shows up and arrests Magneto at the school, and you're absolutely correct, right? I presume that these days even the X-Men don't have secret identities, correct? Which superhero maintains a secret identity in today's Marvel universe? Morph attempts to lighten the mood by transforming into Spiral, one of Mojo's servants in the Mojo world Mojo, but the objective behind transforming into Spiral was to have more hands raised in favor, all in favor, but it ultimately didn't work out. Then, Beast stumbles upon an alarming discovery. There you have it, our Jean is a clone. And I'm aware that this brings back memories of the Clone Saga to a lot of us. The Clone Saga was a Spider-Man story from the 90s that lasted for about 4 years, where the Spider-Man clone returned from the dead. Then it turned out that the Spider-Man we'd known and loved for years was the clone. Then they reversed it. It's a long story. The point is that this whole clone and non-clone story could have dragged on quite a bit in X-Men 97, and I'm glad they resolved it quickly in this episode. Now, Scott isn't sure what actually makes sense, like in the comics when he met Madeline. He thought she might be Jean herself somehow coming back from the dead. At one point, He even asked her directly if she was his dead girlfriend, and she slapped him. Even when Jean came back from the dead, he wasn't sure if he was in love with her or the Phoenix, and almost killed her because he thought she had the power to contain his optic beam like the Phoenix did. In this scene, Wolverine's wearing the black t-shirt he wore all the time in the original series. Mr. Sinister's voice appears over some kind of speakerphone or baby monitor, revealing to Madeline that she's a clone under his control, which also happened in the comics. Meanwhile, Bishop explains the nature of time travel in this universe. We saw this in the second season of the classic cartoon, when Bishop's actions in the past created a time vortex that was affecting Cable's timeline in real time 2,000 years later. Somehow, the past is being altered and the flow of time is realigning, but this is also from the comics. Characters like Precog or Longshot can sense probabilities or possible futures. Mr. Sinister was the main antagonist in the second season of the animated series. He saved Morph's life and then forced him to be his slave. In the second season, he tricked Xavier and Magneto into going to Antarctica, the savage land where he controlled a citadel full of mutants. He kidnapped Jean and used Xavier to lure the X-Men to the citadel, where of course they were defeated. Turns out Scott's optical beams are one of Mr. Sinister's few weaknesses, just like in the comics. Sinister also appeared in the Beyond Good and Evil arc in Season 4, where he worked for Apocalypse to rewrite the time stream so he would have a blank canvas to create his perfect mutant race. In that episode, he calls Magdalene, "My queen, it's time to wake up, my queen," which is a reference to Magdalene's villainous identity, Andy's queen in the comics. Then she breaks a wedding photo, which is a copy of the cover of X-Men number 30, the royal wedding of Scott and Jean Grey. Then she sees a succession of different images. She sees promotional art for the series, but they have replaced a century with a mountain. The next photo is of her with the professor, and as we find out later in this episode, she was the professor's first student, years before he formally opened the school. She was later invited to return to become the fifth X-Man. So what we're seeing here is Jean slowly crumbling, remnants of her past strewn at her feet, slowly receding through the years. Then she floats, levitating most of the room. This reminds me of when Jean became Dark Phoenix in the X-Men movie The Last Stand, and an almost identical version of the scene in X-Men Dark Phoenix. Afterwards, she telekinetically creates the Sick Queen's costume for herself. This costume is also similar to the one she wore as the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club when the Secret Society of Mutants manipulated her mind to bring out her dark side, which of course unleashed the Dark Phoenix. It's important to note that Jean never had the power to create clothes out of thin air, but Phoenix did. It could be that Madeline actually has a part of the Phoenix inside her, just like in the comics. And she says, "Everyone will know my wrath," referencing the crossover from the comics. Later in the episode, Rogue and Magneto are leaving the Danger Room. We're led to believe it's for them to engage in some holographic antics, all very suggestive. But beyond the fact that they've had a past, I think what's happening here is Magneto using his abilities to help Rogue learn to control her powers. Wolverine comments, hinting that Gambit must be really nervous. It's very heartwarming to have this family dynamic among the X-Men characters. Later, Madeline tinkers with each of their minds, showing them their worst fears. This is similar to what Madeline did in the comics when she revolted, creating a version of hell for each hero during the Inferno event. Gambit sees Magneto and Rogue together in a swamp, which I believe is a nod to the Season 2 episode, Outwardly Yours. In summary, this episode shows Gambit's people, the Thieves Guild, making offerings to immortal mutants known as the Externals. And some traumatic things happen to him in a swamp. Here he sees Rogue and Magneto merging, fearing that Rogue will really leave him. This is probably just a joke based on the discovery in You Can X-Men, the issue where Magneto and Rogue were together in the Savage Land, and it was the first time they thought, maybe we should kiss. Roberto and Jubilee are watching TV when a girl simply breaks in, referencing 3 classic horror movies. First, Poltergeist, then The Ring, and finally, the body shape closely resembles Alien from the Enigma of Another World. And the girl herself looks a lot like Magic, the younger sister of Colossus, whom I mentioned earlier. Then she transforms into Roberto's mother, who disapproves of him being a mutant. She says, "Isn't this my son?" Elsewhere, Morpho sees a vision of Mr. Sinister. As I mentioned before, he saved Morpho's life, but then subjected him to mental torture and brainwashing. "I found you inert outside the headquarters of the mutant registry." This is what Mr. Sinister said. In the 4th season, Morpho overcame his fear of Sentinels, but as we see in the opening, he is still very afraid of Sinister, and here he tries to transform himself into the scariest person he knows, Wolverine. Throughout the mansion, various objects turn into monsters, which also happens in Hell when Manhattan Island is transformed into an apocalyptic scene with even an elevator swallowing a guy whole. And then a tentacle transforms into Bishop's sister, Ashard. The last time we saw Ashard, she and Bishop returned to the future together at the end of season 4. This naturally triggers his fear of having abandoned his sister in a future apocalypse while he was safe in the past. But I'm curious as to why Bishop returned to the present after the 5th season. Originally, the plan for the series was for Bishop and Asher to join the team at the end of the 4th season, but it was scrapped when the classic series was renewed for a 5th season. And as always, Beast is the best. Quotation begins. "I think one of us got it wrong," said Beast. This elevator joke probably harkens back to the hungry elevator in the comics. I loved how they adapted the story of Hell into the series. Instead of putting magical demonic powers in Jean's clone, they made Magdalene telepathically manipulate the team to think they're in Hell. Now, in a dreamlike state, the Sentinel appears as a demon, even modeled somewhat after the God Furcher. Cyclops uses his powers to supercharge Bishop. Interestingly, this is even stronger than Cyclops using his own lightning alone. Then the real Jean comes in to save everyone with an exceptional song playing in the background. On a side note, Magdalene Prime's sudden transformation into End's Queen may seem abrupt and escalated quickly, but in the comics it also came out of nowhere. Actually, in the comics, Claremont even made a one-off issue after the Inferno arc mocking the idea of the Jean clone, where aliens appear with another Jean clone that can destroy the world. Morpho explains the origin of the Sinister we learned in the episode Descent, and then he changes to his old appearance from the classic cartoon with dark circles under his eyes from when he was brainwashed in season 2. Now, Jean doesn't remember how to control her abilities, which is why her parents hired Xavier to help her. You can see in the episode how Magneto despises Mr. Sinister. He captured him in Antarctica, and when the two briefly worked for Apocalypse, Magneto actually turned on and fought Sinister. As I mentioned before, Morpho transforms into Magic, and after Magdalene takes control, he transforms into the most demonic form of magic, Shadow Child. I think this is just a fun Easter egg from the comics Inferno event, and I seriously doubt we'll see that backstory play out in this series. Back at the mansion, Wolverine takes care of Jean, and I bet it was at that moment that he realized there were suddenly 2 Jeans in the world. When he manages to reach her, she says, "I'm everything to you." Jean had known about Wolverine's feelings for her since the 1st season. His behavior around her was unusual. So Jean fights Madeline on the astral plane, just like in the comics, and as we saw in the episode Xavier Remembers, when she and the professor fought against the Shadow King together. Jean's visualization as a glowing figure also recalls the parallel story in classic X-Men where the Phoenix takes Jean's form. As Jean shows Madeline her memories, we see this visualized by a Victorian-era clock with a red diamond in the center, which is Mr. Sinister's emblem. This is a subtle way of showing his mental control over her. The clock fades away into the professor's original wheelchair before it was replaced by a more modern one. This scene and Amy's death, her best friend, are taken straight from the comics, the moment when her powers first showed up. Then they both are swallowed by Jean Grey and they're suddenly in the womb with baby Nathan. This implies that Jean and Madeline are now facets of the same being. They have distinct memories, but when you combine these memories, they fabricate an entire lifetime. In addition, the rift that opens up here strongly reminds of when Beyonder addressed the heroes and villains in Secret Wars. And the memory of her son's birth is what finally shatters Mr. Sinister's control over her. In the comics, baby Nathan's name is also a part of Sinister's mind manipulation over Madeline. Nathan is Mr. Sinister's real name, Nathaniel Essex. Scott has always despised the name, but it was Madeline's idea before Sinister left. He recites an old rhyme in 15th century English. Ladybug, ladybug, I'm going home. Your house is on fire and your children are gone. The actual words have changed over the years, but the meaning has remained the same. Your home is in crisis and you will lose your family. In this case, Mr. Sinister is referring to the virus he used to infect Nathan. So, what's the deal with the virus? In the comics, it's Apocalypse who infects Nathan with the techno-organic virus, which turns living matter into machinery just like in the series. To save his life, Scott has to send him to the future, except in the comics he sends him with a future cultist named Ascani, who believes Nathan is his messianic figure. In the series we have seen the techno-organic virus before. The Apocalypse developed it in the episode Time Runaways, where Greg and Creed used the virus to make people think mutants were spreading a plague. Bishop traveled back in time to stop the plague, so Cable traveled back in time to stop Bishop because it was discovered that the mutants had to develop antibodies to stop this virus from exterminating them. It all resolved when Cable infected Wolverine with the virus and his healing factor created the antibodies. In this episode, when Madeline suggests that Bishop take Nathan to the future, he says, I know a guy there, and that guy is an elder version of Forge, a mutant with machine building abilities. We actually met Forge in the present day in the episode Cold Comforts, when we saw him leading the X-Factor team and then teaming up with Beast, Magneto, and Sinister to stop the Phalanx in Season 5. And he also appears at the end of this episode, but we'll talk about that in a bit. When Scott realizes he can't be with Nathan, he says, I won't be like my father. I will not abandon my son. Remember that Scott's father is the space pirate Corsair, and when they met again in the original series, he initially resented him for being away for so long. And that scene where Madeline reassures the baby and implants these comforting memories in him, damn, it's amazing, isn't it? And what happens to the baby? In the future, the baby grows up to be Cable, which is why half of his body is machine. His telekinetic abilities are always holding the techno-organic virus at bay. Back at the end of the episode, the two genes say goodbye and decide it doesn't really matter when they got switched. There's a theory about that I'll talk about in a few seconds. Afterwards, Scott and Jean go back to the bedroom with the broken bed between them, showing the new tension in their marriage. Then we see Storm in a bar in Dallas wearing her awesome 80s punk outfit. She meets the current version of Forge. Forge met the X-Men in the episode Cold Comfort, where he and Xavier didn't seem to know each other. But Storm wasn't in that episode, so it makes sense that they're meeting here for the first time, and it looks like Forge is going to restore her powers. It's worth noting that in the comics, Forge was the one who invented the weapon that stole Storm's powers. After they fell in love, he found a way to restore them. This is explored in one of the greatest X-Men issues ever, Life and Death, which is the title of an episode later this season. So I'm not going to explain too much right now so as not to give spoilers. As for when Jean was swapped last week, I pointed out that Mr. Sinister had Jean alone at his base in Antarctica in Season 2, and that would have been enough time to clone her, but it's strange that the real Jean has memories of everything that's happened since then. Also, we see Jean being cloned in this lab that's not in Antarctica, presumably very close to the mansion. Jean also disappeared for several episodes when the Phoenix took the Crumb Crystal to the sun, mysteriously reappearing on the shores of M Island with the Phoenix still inside her. The problem is that both Jeans remember having the Phoenix Force inside them, so they would have been swapped after the Dark Phoenix saga. I think they were probably exchanged during the invasion of the Phalanx. It was a Body Raider style arc that opened season 5, and Sinister is one of the few people who hasn't been assimilated by the aliens. There would have been a very short period in which he could have kidnapped Jean's body and cloned her. We even see her and Scott reunite at the end of the arc to show that they had been separated for a while. I don't know, let me know your theories about when exactly Jean was swapped in the comments below. I'd love to talk about the subjects of the video. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Suggestions for the next videos are popping up here now. It makes perfect sense for you to watch them. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you later.